services. Most of you, I think, have interacted with the services window. Services are basically set of automatic tasks that are performed for any particular application that you install within the servers. Services are basically set of tasks and uh, scheduled automated tasks that are performed for any particular application. If you install any application inside a server, and that application wants to perform certain tasks automatically and cannot depend on humans to do that, it's going to create a service on the server, and that service is going to perform those tasks on periodic basis, right? Our vault needs to perform certain tasks as well. And for that, it's going to create some of the services inside the CyberArk Vault server. Let's understand what those services are and what kind of functionalities do they perform. Okay. All right. CyberArk Vault Services. So there are some mandatory services and there are some optional services within the vault. Mandatory as in you have to keep those services running. If any one of those services gets stopped, your vault is going to stop functioning. So let's understand these mandatory services first, and then we will switch to the optional ones. Mandatory services. The first one you have is called PrivateArk database. PrivateArk database is basically a service that is responsible to maintain CyberArk database. Maintain as in you yourself do not get to interact with the database tables. The software does that internally. Okay? You do not get to interact with the database tables. So let's say you modify some information on your vault, you change some values in the configuration file, some parameters in the configuration file, you onboarded some accounts. All those changes that you are doing on the UI are going to be updated on the backend database automatically. But who does that? There's no human involved in the process. The service is responsible to do that. PrivateArk database service is responsible to maintain the CyberArk database. Yeah. The PrivateArk database service needs to be running on both the primary and disaster recovery server. Disaster recovery vault. Disaster recovery vault. Disaster recovery is basically a concept. If you are not aware, disaster recovery is basically you create a replica of your infrastructure, you create a backup of your infrastructure, and in case when your primary servers are not responding, your primary systems are not responding, and they are impacted, and users are not able to use your primary systems, in those cases, the disaster recovery can act as a backup system, and your users can use retrieve the information from that disaster recovery system, so that even the primary systems are impacted, the user service should not be interrupted. That's why we use disaster recovery for any application, and Vault is no exception here. Disaster recovery architecture is going to be set up in every organizational architecture. You'll see a disaster recovery vault which contains the exact same information what you have in your primary vault, and this disaster recovery vault is supposed to replicate all the information from the primary vault to the disaster recovery vault in real time. We'll talk about that. We'll have a separate session on disaster recovery. We'll see how it works. But this disaster recovery server is supposed to be exact replica and replicate the information from the primary vault in real time. And for that reasons, it also needs to maintain the database. And that is why the PrivateArk database service needs to be running on both the primary and disaster recovery vault. Okay. The next service we have, the next mandatory service we have is called PrivateArk server. PrivateArk server is basically responsible to maintain the internal logs of CyberArk Vault. Internal logs of CyberArk Vault, it's basically a event management system. Let's say if anything that's going, any event that is happening inside CyberArk Vault, any encryption event gets started or stopped, any firewall communication gets allowed or restricted, um, any authentication failure related to Vault, all the events that are technically related to this CyberArk Vault application is going to be recorded in a file called italog.log, italog.log, and this file contains all the events that are happening. This file is going to be maintained by this PrivateArk server. All the events will be written in this log file by this PrivateArk server. Basically, it is an event management system that helps you in troubleshooting if any issues are happening with CyberArk Vault. So PrivateArk server is responsible to maintain internal logs of CyberArk Vault, writes all the information in a file called itlog.log. And this is a mandatory service. So if at any point of time, the service stops, that means your vault will stop functioning. Okay. So we'll have to keep this service running at all times. And the last mandatory service we have is CyberArk Logic Container. CyberArk Logic Container is basically responsible to execute the processes defined on the vault configuration file. Responsible to execute the processes defined on the vault configuration file. That means any configuration files that you have inside CyberArk, any values that you change or modify any parameter, that will be read by this logic container service, and it's going to execute those parameters, those values, in order to dictate the behavior of CyberArk Vault. Okay, how does the processes are going to look like? So CyberArk logic container responsible to execute all the processes, reads your configuration file, and does all the work. So there are three mandatory service. Has to be, all of them has to be running at all times. Any one of this service gets stopped, your vault is going to stop functioning. So from the technical standpoint, these services has to be running at all times. Okay? But that's not true for optional services. Yes, optional service. Okay, let's talk about your service, Kapil. First, optional services, as in from technical standpoint, you do not have to start them always. You can stop them, but those feature enhancement will not be there. Okay, optional services are always there just for feature enhancement. So from the best practice standpoint, these services should be running, but from the technical perspective, even if you stop them, these services would not affect the vault functionality. Okay? So the first service we have here is Hardened Windows Firewall. Hardened Windows Firewall is a service that is responsible to maintain the firewall system within the vault. So by default, when you install the Vault application on a server, on a Windows server, uh, the Vault starts controlling the existing firewall system. It disables all the existing rules, restricts all the communication, and only allows the port number 1858 to work. And as long as this service is running, hardened Windows firewall, the Vault server will be isolated. Only port 1858 will be running, and unless you decide to do the modification of the firewall rules, by default, it's only going to allow 1858 to work and all the component communication to happen. As long as this service is running, your Vault server is isolated. Your Vault server is isolated from any outside resources. So we can stop this service. The Vault will still function, but a lot of outside resources will be allowed to communicate with the Vault server, which is not a great idea from the best practice standpoint. So this service should be running inside the Vault server. Okay. Second one we have here is event notification engine. Event notification engine is responsible to trigger automatic email alerts. Now, this is not an end-to-end CyberArk functionality. This CyberArk has to be, the Vault server has to be integrated with SMTP server. Right, SMTP means simple mail transfer protocol. Simple mail transfer protocol, which will allow you to trigger auto-generated emails. Okay, auto-generated mails can be triggered using this simple mail transfer protocol. We are going to have a separate session on this. The Vault has to be integrated with the simple mail transfer protocol server, and only when the integration is done, the CyberArk Vault will be able to trigger automatic email alerts based on the events that are happening inside CyberArk Vault. So let's say if CyberArk is not able to manage the password of a particular account, there are some errors, some issues that needs to be taken care of, that needs to be troubleshooted. So CyberArk is going to trigger an automatic email alerts to the administrators or auditors so that they can take some remediation actions. Right? If at any point of time, if let's say some mandatory services is not responding, the Vault needs to trigger an automatic alerts so that the actions can be taken at the earliest. Right? So event notification engine allows the administrators and auditors to be notified for any issues or any events that are happening in CyberArk in real time. Okay? That's what event notification engine does. We'll have a separate session on this where we will talk about the integration part, and we'll also talk about the customizations that you can make in the event notification engine system. So it allows a lot of customization parameters. You can decide which events trigger the notification. Is it authentication failures? Is it any services started or stopped? So those type of events, you can decide which events triggers those notification, who receives the alerts, who gets the alert based on each of the event, and the template of the emails, like how does the emails look like. Okay? You can decide the body line, you can decide the subject line, all of those customizations you can do, and we will talk about that in a separate session. But this service has to be running if you need this feature to be there in your CyberArk architecture, event notification engine. The next thing we have is PrivateArk remote control agent. PrivateArk remote control agent. Has anyone ever worked with any monitoring system here? Monitoring?
Oh, yes, Kibana.
Right, right. So how does a typical monitoring system work? You install agents in multiple systems which you want to monitor, right? Similarly, on the Vault server, let me try to explain it with more graphical terms. Let's say we have a vault here. Within the vault, we have some services, some mandatory services that we want to monitor, that we want to keep a check on if they are running or not. We have certain OS parameters, operating system parameters, such as the space in our vault, disk space, what is the memory usage, what is the CPU utilization, right? All these parameters we need to monitor constantly to ensure that our vault health status is fine and it is there is no upcoming uh, issues. There is no upcoming issues. So we need to monitor these parameters constantly. Uh, you can assign an administrator who will log into this vault server frequently in order to do the monitoring. The administrator can be allowed to log into this vault server and they can do the manual monitoring as well. But the administrators might have to log in 2 or 3 times in one day, and the process will be tedious, not very effective. And also, you do not really advise frequent logins to the vault server if it is not necessary. So in this case, we can automate this entire monitoring process by using CyberArk's own monitoring software. This agent can be installed on the Vault server. It's called PrivateArk Remote Control Agent. PrivateArk Remote Control Agent can collect information on CyberArk Vault. It can collect information in CyberArk Vault. All these information can be collected by this remote control agent, and we can transfer this information to a server which is easily accessible for us. Okay, maybe a server which is in our Active Directory domain, let's say, uh, and a server which already has a connectivity from this particular domain to this particular server to the vault. So most likely you're going to install it in one of the component server itself from where the connectivity is already established, either the PVWA or CPM or PSM. Should not take much space, very uh, light software. You can install the client here in the one of the component server, which is easily accessible for you. This is called PrivateArk Remote Control Client. PrivateArk Remote Control Client. Now this agent, as soon as it collects all the information, this agent transfers all the information to this remote control client. Since we already have the communication established through port 1858, it's the agent is going to communicate to this remote control client through port 1858. There is no additional firewall exception required. The agent is going to transfer all the information to the remote control client, and the client can prepare a dashboard for us. It can prepare a dashboard for us, which will provide more visibility on what's happening on the vault server, including the numerics on each of these parameter, the operating system parameter, and whether the services status are running or not. So it's going to give you much more visibility without logging into the vault server, and it's going to be updated in real time. So that's how the CyberArk's internal monitoring agent works. Does basic monitoring, it does not go into the depth of monitoring. Just the basic monitoring is like some operating system metrics and mandatory service status. That's all. But it can be used to automate the existing monitoring system in your CyberArk architecture. And when you do want that functionality, you need to start this remote control agent service. You have to install the agent, and the agent will build this service on the Vault server. So remote control agent is basically responsible to monitor the services status, operating system parameters on the Vault, keep a constant check on the Vault health status. And the last service we have is basically CyberArk Vault Disaster Recovery Service. CyberArk Vault Disaster Recovery. CyberArk Vault Disaster Recovery Service is basically responsible for replication of information from one vault to another. From one vault to another. And this disaster recovery service is going to be, since it has the functionality to replicate the information from one vault to another, it's going to be started on your disaster recovery server, because that's our use case. We want to replicate the information from the primary vault to the disaster recovery vault, because we want to create a backup system so that if something goes wrong with our primary vault, if at some point of time due to some issues our primary vault is impacted, the disaster recovery vault has the same set of information, and we can allow our users to retrieve the information from the disaster recovery vault, even if the primary vault is impacted, so that we can avoid the interruption in user services. Okay? So responsible for replication of information from one vault to another, and this service has to be running on the disaster recovery vault. And that's it. The service is not meant for the primary systems, because the primary systems does not need to replicate the information from anywhere. Only the disaster recovery vault will have this DR service running. That's all. Okay. These optional services are not, from technical standpoint, they are not necessary, but if you do not start them, you might miss out on some features that can expose the Vault server. So from the best practice standpoint, these optional services has to be running at all times. Okay? This is a very important topic from interview and certification perspectives. These services are very important.